Enjoy with your headphones for a better listening experience.
Please watch till the end of the video to have the most scariest part of the story.
Pilots, what's the scariest stuff you've seen while flying? Airline pilot here. I'm an airline captain based out of LAX. The following is the closest I've come to biting it thus far in my career. On a commercial aircraft, you generally have three sources of bleed air that take air from the engines, and a little device in the back of the airplane called the APU, and use it to pressurize the cabin. You can't breathe the air at 35,000 feet, so the cabin is pressurized by these bled air sources to a breathable altitude of at or below 8,000 feet. There are three sources because 1, redundancy increases safety, and 2, you can still dispatch the airplane if one is inox because there are backups. One of the bleed sources, on the number 2 engine, was already broken, so maintenance deferred it, indicating we were still safe to fly on the remaining 2 sources. Which is fine, you just take off with the APU running as a backup bleed source. While on the takeoff roll, immediately after becoming airborne, our APU fails. Which leaves us with just one bleed source to pressurize the cabin, the bleed air from the number 1 engine. If that fails, we have nothing to keep the air inside the cabin pressurized to a lower altitude than the airplane is flying at. You won't be able to breathe at high altitudes. It's a short flight, and we aren't going up too high, so I'm optimistic that we can get up to our low cruising altitude, message dispatch and maintenance, and receive their agreement that the flight is safe to continue on one bleed source. I text our company a message describing the situation via ACARS, a satellite-based texting capability our aircraft has to communicate with people on the ground. But they never had the chance to get back to us. Passing 25,000 feet, I go to inhale, but feel the air gently move out of my lungs instead of into them. Unable to breathe normally, immediately my eyes shoot to the cabin altitude gauge, which is showing us at 8,000 feet cabin altitude and rising quickly. That explains the reverse air movement. In fact, the cabin altitude is rising at the exact same rate of climb as our airplane, indicating the airplane has lost all pressurization capabilities and is depressurizing rapidly. At that instant, we get a warning chime and message on our ICAS, engine information and crew alerting system, essentially a computer screen that tells us when it goes wrong, that says bleed 1 fail. With our bleed 1 source now failed, our APU having failed on the takeoff roll, and bleed 2 already deferred, we are completely out of ways to pressurize the aircraft. If we don't descend to a safe altitude immediately, the cabin altitude will rise high enough that the air is no longer breathable. This is a fundamental problem. High cabin altitude killed everyone on board Helios Airways Flight 522, and there are countless other examples of depressurization causing injuries and fatalities. Immediately I threw off my sunglasses and headset and donned my full-face oxygen mask and smoke goggles. It provides 100% pure oxygen under a forced flow, rated up to an altitude of 41,000 feet. My first officer does the same. This is the first thing you do because if the pilots die, there is nobody to fly the jet and everyone else dies. Then we immediately declare an emergency and initiate an emergency descent, nosing over to our maximum speed while deploying the speed brakes to generate maximum drag. We receive clearance down to 10,000 feet and begin executing a 180-degree turn to go back to LAX. ATC does a fantastic job vectoring aircraft out of our way. SoCal airspace is some of the busiest in the world, but we got priority handling all the way back to LAX. The cabin altitude nearly reached hazardous levels but didn't go high enough for the oxygen masks in the cabin to automatically deploy. It was definitely high enough that the passengers would have noticed but wouldn't have had a concrete idea of what was going on. Aside from that's odd. The cabin also got quite hot because there was no more pressurized, conditioned air flowing to cool it off. We landed at LAX on the longest runway with the fire trucks rolling to assist us, just in case. Fortunately, none of the passengers or crew reported any injuries from the sudden increase in cabin altitude. We parked at the gate and deplaned, and I made an announcement to the passengers about what had just happened, using small words and downplaying everything so as not to scare everyone. 12 Chinese passengers on our flight were on a West Coast tour, and they were terribly upset that their trip was inconvenienced by this emergency. No problem, I totally understand the frustration. So, I spoke to their translator, who spoke in turn to her group, and I gave her the full and incredibly detailed explanation of what happened. As I explained what happened, the expressions on these 12 passengers' faces went from angry, to surprised, to fearful, and finally thankful. Before I walked away, all 12 of them bowed to me in respect. That was something I have never experienced before or since then in my entire aviation career. We ended up swapping airplanes to one that wasn't sick, and completed the flight as planned about 3 hours behind schedule. I slept well that night, and the passengers probably went on to complain about their flight being delayed several hours due to a maintenance issue, smiley face. Navy carrier pilot here. My story is more about what I couldn't see. I joined a squadron on deployment near Guam for a couple of months one time. It had been about 6 months since I had landed on a carrier, so I had to do a few day and night passes to get current again. My first night with them, the plan was for me to get 2 traps. We would come down as the first plane in the recovery, launch again, and come back in as the last plane in the recovery. Nothing crazy, we do it all the time to keep both pilots current, the only thing different is I would fly both passes. This night was overcast, so no moonlight made it through to the surface of the ocean, making it very dark when you descend through the clouds. It's also in the middle of the ocean. It is so dark that you can't tell where the water ends and the sky starts. Not that it mattered though, because we were still in the clouds down at 1,200 feet. As we are coming down first in the conga line of aircraft on 2-minute intervals, we hear paddles, the pilots on the back of the ship who help guide you down, say 99, the deck is moving. This means that the flight deck is pitching, rolling, and or heaving with the ship's motion more than it usually does. This happens occasionally, and it's always a bit unsure, but that's what paddles is there for. Anyway, as we are flying our needles down toward the ship, we pass 400 feet at about 1 mile and we're still in the clouds in the dark. We get to the normal handoff point between the approach controller and paddles at 3/4 mile. Approach says, show you on and on, 3/4 mile, call the ball. This is the point where we would look outside and confirm that we see the lights on the ship that guide you in on the correct glide slope. In carrier aviation, if you can't see the ball or you don't know where you are on glide slope for some reason, you say Clara, meaning clarify my position, at least that's what I always assumed it stood for, and paddles will step in on the radio and give you some help. Well, in this case, we can't even see the ship, so we respond with Clara ship. Paddles comes back with 601, taxi light on. That means they can't see us either and they need us to turn the taxi light on, so they know where we are. We turn the taxi light on, and Paddles says, paddles contact and continues to talk us down towards the deck. We're probably passing through 150 feet here. Eventually, we finally broke active 3 to 5 seconds later, we hit the deck and came to a stop. It was raining so hard we could barely see the taxi director on the deck. They take us to the bow catapults, and we shoot off into the darkness to do it again lol. Luckily, the weather cleared a bit, and the deck steadied a bit for the second pass. That still remains the craziest thing I have done in an airplane. A helicopter about 30 to 40 feet off my wing. I landed at an uncontrolled field, and as I was making my radio calls coming in, I heard a helicopter also coming onto land and refueling. I didn't need to refuel, so once I landed and did the checklist I turned around and went back to the end of the runway. The end I was taking off happened to be the opposite end of where the fuel farm was. I waited for a couple of other planes to land, including a beautiful red biplane, made all the radio calls like you're supposed to, taxied out onto the runway, and took off. As I was going over the far end of the runway, near the fuel farm, suddenly my iPad screamed at me warning traffic 9 o'clock 100 feet below. I was like WTAF and hauled the yoke over to the right. Whereupon I see a helicopter shoot up past my left wing, way closer than you should ever be to another aircraft. He finished refueling and then just took off without making any radio calls, or listening to anyone else's radio calls, apparently. Many choice words were said over the radio by me. The guy lined up to take off after me goes. So yes, that was fun. I always keep a side eye on helicopters after that little bit of excitement. My airfield where I did my pilot training had a waterway at the approach end of the runway, and oftentimes there were sailboats heading out to sea as you were coming into land. Usually came in a little high since the runway was long enough. One day, not long after I had completed my first solo, I was doing my run-up, waiting for one of the regular pilots to land his low-wing sport airplane. He obviously didn't see the mast of the sailboat crossing, and he hit it. The plane cartwheeled down the runway and broke into pieces. I took my plane back to the tie-downs to clear the area, and then went to help him out of the plane before it caught on fire, which it didn't amazingly enough. The pilot broke both of his hands at the wrists and fractured a whole bunch of stuff. Unfortunately, he was a surgeon. Not sure if he will be able to work again. Needless to say, I was always incredibly careful on approach after that. Major Brian Schul. Schul was the first pilot to author a book about flying the State Route 71. This story comes from his book Sled Driver, Flying the World's Fastest Jet, first published in 1991, now in its 6th printing. Walter and I had just completed the 100 hours required to attain mission-ready status on the jet. Ripping across the Arizona deserts 80,000 feet below us, I could already see the coast of California. I was beginning to feel a bit sorry for Walter in the back seat. There he was, with no really pleasant view of the incredible sights before us, tasked with monitoring 4 different radios. The predominant radio chatter was from Los Angeles Center, controlling daily traffic in their sector. While they had us on their scope, albeit briefly, we were in uncontrolled airspace and normally would not talk to them unless we needed to descend into their airspace. We listened to the shaky voice of a lone Cessna pilot asking Center for a readout of his ground speed. Center replied, November Charlie 175, I'm showing you at 90 knots on the ground. Now the thing to understand about Center controllers was that whether they were talking to a newcomer pilot in a Cessna or to Air Force One, they always spoke in the exact same, calm, deep, professional, tone that made one feel important. I referred to it as the Houston Center voice. Conversely, over the years, pilots always wanted to ensure that, when transmitting, they sounded like Chuck Yeager, or at least like John Wayne. Better to die than sound bad on the radios. Just moments after the Cessna's inquiry, a Twin Beach piped up on frequency, in a rather superior tone, asking for his ground speed. I have you at 125 knots of ground speed. Boy, I thought, Beechcraft really must think he is dazzling his Cessna brethren. Then unexpectedly, a Navy F/A-18 pilot out of Naval Air Station Lemoore came up on frequency. You knew right away it was a Navy jock because he sounded very cool on the radios. Center, Dusty 52 ground speed check. Before Center could reply, I'm thinking to myself, hey, Dusty 52 has a ground speed indicator in that $1 million cockpit, so why is he asking Center for a readout? Then I got it. Old Dusty here is making sure that every bug smasher from Mount Whitney to the Mojave knows what true speed is. He's the fastest man in the valley today, and he just wants everyone to know how much fun he is having in his new Hornet. And the reply, always with that same calm voice, with more distinct alliteration than emotion, Dusty 52, Center, we have you at 620 on the ground. And I thought to myself, is this a ripe situation, or what? As my hand instinctively reached for the mic button, I had to remind myself that Walt was in control of the radios. Still, I thought, it must be done. That Hornet must die and die now. Then I heard it. The click of the mic button from the back seat. That was the very moment that I knew Walter and I had become crew members. Very professionally, Walter spoke, Los Angeles Center, Aspen 20, can you give us a ground speed check? There was no hesitation, Aspen 20, I show you at 1,842 knots, across the ground. I think it was the 42 knots that I liked the best, so accurate and proud was Center to deliver that information without hesitation, and you just knew he was smiling. Walt keyed the mic once again to say, in his most fighter pilot-like voice, Center, much thanks, we're showing closer to 1900 on the money. For a moment, Walter was a god. And we finally heard a little crack in the armor of the Houston Center voice, when LA came back with Roger that Aspen. Your equipment is probably more accurate than ours. You boys have a good one. It all had lasted for just moments, but in that short, memorable sprint across the Southwest, the Navy had been flamed, all mortal airplanes on frequency were forced to bow before the king of speed, and more importantly, Walter and I had crossed the threshold of being a crew. A fine day's work. We never heard another transmission on that frequency all the way to the coast. My dad told me a story from a few years ago that happened while flying a 737 somewhere in Nevada, I think on the way back to Toronto. It was late in the evening, so you couldn't see too much, but all of a sudden to the left of the plane my dad saw a really bright ball of light, I guess you could say, moving really fast across the sky. My dad and his co-pilot had no clue what it was, and they could hear other pilots nearby calling it in over the radio and asking what it was. Eventually it flew past and disappeared into the distance. A few days later my dad found out that what he saw was a missile launched by a USN submarine. I wonder how many passengers thought they saw a UFO lol. Smoke in the cockpit when I landed. Thankfully, it was when I landed. Had to push the airplane, small Cessna, off the runway. Almost had 2 mid-air collisions. One due to a new pilot not being where he should be, another due to control telling me an aircraft was at me 11 o'clock when really it was at me 2 o'clock. And the coolest was a meteor that burned up directly in front of me. Same altitude, straight ahead. I have no idea how far away it was, but it was bright, and so pretty. Went through a spectrum of colors as it burned. A skydiver about 20 yards off my wing. Was flying a 172 into an uncontrolled field that I've flown into 100 times before, not knowing that after a 5-year ban in skydiving there, they were allowing it on a case-by-case request. While flying in, calling my position, I hear skydiver in the air. My first thought was I hope they aren't this direction, and then there he was. I had this image of him going through my prop. After that thought, oh God, please don't let me kill this guy. Then I turned to WTF just happened, and how did the pilot not call this out better? He flew off completely. Come to find out the pilot was flying his friend to skydive to his local field, then departed to his home airport where they came from. I never did find the guy. Not a pilot, but I was in the bathroom when the pilot came over the radio with a quick announcement that we were about to have turbulence and to buckle up. Everyone sat down, including the flight attendants, and buckled up. Everyone but me was in the process of taking a massive thing. The kind of thing you don't want to have during turbulence. Now I've been in turbulence. It's rough. This was something else. I somehow, by all the way mighty, finished my thing and completed the post paperwork. And flushed, didn't want to change it, when the turbulence hit. To say I hit everything is an understatement. I bounced off the ceiling, hit the floor, back up, face to the toilet. It was hell, and I just kept my face covered and I protected my head as best I could. After a bit of luck, I managed to get myself wedged under the toilet and I stayed there till the bumpy ride ended. I left the bathroom to some laughter and a lot of concern. Seeing them in their seats was fine, until they heard screaming in the bathroom, and loud crashing noises followed by dreadful silence. They all thought I died. Not a pilot, but my dad is a former one. He once told me about how he almost crashed his Cessna because he hit some geese. He was actually preparing for a landing approach when he hit geese flying in a patch of fog. The windshield was completely shattered, and he and his passenger were covered in blood and feathers. They landed safely, but my dad was pretty scared from that. He didn't quit flying because of that, but bird strikes remained a constant fear of his. Geese are large birds, and they did considerable damage to that little planet. This actually happened on my first time flying with no instructor on board, just doing a couple laps around the traffic pattern. Took off, laps number 1 and number 2 went simply fine, nailed a couple radio calls, got that awesome feeling of yeah, I got this. But lap number 3 was fine until I was setting up my final approach to land, and the GTN 750, basically a fancy navigation/radio/pseudo-radar system, warned me about a Cessna 1 mile out at the same altitude. Ignored it, since I already had the plane in sight and verified with the control tower that he was landing on the runway parallel to mine. Lo and behold, this man zips under me by about 200 to 300 feet, which sounds like a good amount of room, but is actually butt-blenchingly close in a busy airspace like this. I should have applied full throttle and circled back around to try again, but the other plane was clear of me before the startle factor even wore off. This was made especially dangerous by the fact that the plane I was flying was low wing, can't see under me, and the other plane was high wing, he couldn't see above him. So, neither of us could see each other, and the tower yelled at the guy to get out of my way, and I landed safely. I'm not a pilot, but I took a few lessons years ago just for the experience. We were practicing landings, and as we lined up on the runway we started our final. As we're going down, the instructor notices a shadow on the ground slightly to our right. It was another plane going to land on our runway and was above us. We had radioed our intentions earlier, but don't know if he did. The instructor took over and peeled off. The guy didn't land, just kept going. We circled and went in. Apparently no one saw it. Not a pilot, but AF Combat Systems officer. We were on a military training route, pretty much what it sounds like, airspace that is supposed to be cleared out so military jets can practice maneuvers without worrying too much about civilian aircraft. We're at 300 feet AGL cruising along at 420 knots when our CAS, collision alert system using onboard radar, starts blaring at us. We all look around and don't see anything around us, when suddenly some jackass in a little prop plane, who wasn't squawking, pulls into a climb about 50 feet off our nose. The pilot brakes hard to the right and we narrowly avoided a mid-air collision. Flying a Cessna 172 with my instructor out toward Blythe on the way to San Diego hangar when a sandstorm blew up underneath us. I swear the sand was so close it was causing the landing gear tires to spin. This was on a 3-leg check flight. We had landed at Big Bear, California for fuel and a hot low-pressure system moved in pretty quickly. It was moving in as we were getting there, like really hot 120 degrees or so, and the air was already really thin. A kid in his solo was taking off and he got her up off the end of the runway and he just fell out of the sky and crashed. The air was too thin because of the heat, and he ran out of the runway because he couldn't get up to speed and just pulled up instead of listening to tower and aborting. Crashed and died. Navy helicopter pilot here. I've got two. That would be a tie, hearing a once per revolution thumping coming from the rotor head. Then on approach to land the torque gauges went dead, indicating a double engine failure. Luckily, the engines were still running, unlike the gauges. Hearing the rotor RPM suddenly decrease for no known reason, followed up by a master warning indicating an engine failure. The engine restarted itself a moment later and it was all good. Also, teaching people to land on ships at night is just generally terrifying. Not a pilot, but this happened on a commercial flight, and we were never told what actually happened. The cabin started becoming visibly smoky and smelled strongly of smoke. I was in the window seat and the wall/window became hot to the touch. The scariest part was that the flight attendants were clearly panicking. They were running up and down the aisles frantically feeling all of the overhead bins for something on fire. They asked us repeatedly to check our devices to make sure nothing was overheating. People were having panic attacks and I started wondering what it would feel like to die/how it would happen. The pilot announced that we were close enough to the airport that we were going to continue, about 15 to 20 minutes, and have an emergency landing. When we landed, the runway was lined with fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue vehicles. They didn't let us off the plane for quite some time. Ultimately, firefighters boarded and ushered us off. They never told us what happened. I had to fly back, same airline, 2 days later. While checking my bags, the employee said, "OMG, you were on that flight, that was bad." He gave us $15 in flight credit and told us to call the airline for more compensation. Never did, but I still wonder what happened. Not a pilot, but my dad is. That said, we were flying out of Las Vegas and upon takeoff we nearly collided with another aircraft. This other guy never radioed into tower, never mentioned anything about landing, just off in his own little world as if he owned the air. He was in a twin-engine Beech, we were in a single-prop Cessna. We were literally within 200 feet of each other, enough that we could see one another, and could probably smell the thing we were scraping out. Except their pilot. Because that guy was so clueless he probably didn't even know there was a runway there. I wouldn't be surprised if he were trying to land on the actual Las Vegas Strip. Not a pilot, but you haven't experienced thrill and terror until you've been a passenger in a C-17 Globemaster performing low-level mountain maneuvers. I'm a crew chief on C-17s and had the privilege of sitting in a crew seat during these low levels in a 4-plane formation. These planes are immense, and you just can't imagine them being able to move like this. Thunderstorms on either side when I was in a Cessna 152, a bit smaller than a C-172. They developed pretty quickly, and we thought we'd have to turn back, but there was a big enough opening to fly through. The windshield got nice and clean too. Another one was seeing the engine start shaking when a part of the oil system blew. I thought it would die on me and I would have to land on some farmland or on a small road. Fortunately, we ended up being stuck with one power setting, which was also pretty bad, and could fly it back to the airport. Final approach, flying a Cessna 172 and pulled power back a little to maintain glide slope. The engine started to cut out completely and the prop started to move a little too slowly for my liking at that moment. Recovered with power and landed normally, but had to have it looked into. I live under the approach path to 26 at Essendon Airport in Australia. There is a 172 which must be used by a flight school because I see it making dodgy approaches from time to time. The other week as he flew over the valley between my place and the airport I could see he was well below the glide slope and sure enough the pilot put a lot of power on to correct, but after that he was out of sorts. Too high at the threshold and sinking too fast again. The airport is on a plateau which I can't really see, but I did snatch a view of him proposing along the runway at about 20 feet or so. To borrow my late uncle's story, he confided in me. He had a 182 on floats, and on several occasions was happy to play family airlines so that various relatives could make weddings and other events that were just too far for driving and overnighting. One trip was from home base, Vancouver to Kamloops in the interior. He flew VFR and it was a pretty simple task to head out up the Fraser Valley until it pinched off at the town of Hope. At that point there is a notch in the wall of mountains through which the Coquihalla River and Highway 5 goes. From there, following Highway 5 northeast brings you straight into Kamloops, their destination that day. Probably a 200-mile flight. The morning flight went fine, the 3 passengers went to their event, and come afternoon's end, they headed back in what were supposed to be clear skies. Supposed. Flying the reverse route, clouds began to form quickly on the forested sides of the valley, and soon rolled over the small plain. He was fairly confident of his heading and stuck to it as the sky whited out. It was all he could do in a day without sat-nav equipment. If he were off by only a few degrees, they'd fly right into the mountainside. His passengers seemed to take no notice, engaged as they were in recounting the day's events. Trying to climb above the cloud was just as dangerous. Small single-engine Cessnas are not pressurized, and even if they topped it, say, 6,000 feet, the last thing he wanted was to pop out on top of what might be a white surface as far as the eye could see. If he could drop down once past Hope, there was a good chance of flying under the soup back to Vancouver. It was, he said, the only time he was really scared in his airplane. The miles ticked away, they should be nearing Hope. He never saw it. Suddenly the clouds scattered and before him spread the valley under a high ceiling. He'd threaded the needle and been right not to chance climbing. They landed at the South Airport, and no one even commented about the can of paint they'd flown through. Didn't make me want to be a pilot. Not a pilot but a skydiver. We called to clear the airspace over the airport for a jump and then made our jump run. I was in free fall when I saw a small plus below me and then it rapidly grew larger. I quickly realized a student pilot out of a nearby flight school didn't know enough to clear the airspace and I flew past his wing at terminal velocity. Just a small difference and I would have ripped right through that little Cessna. I landed without incident, but I'm certain the pilot never even knew how close he came to death that day. Oh, one more, flying out of Palomar Airport and the old Codegri WW2 pilot that was teaching me to fly says it's time to touch and goes for an hour. So, we land. I'm feeling worthy cause I can land a plane. I get in the pattern, tell Tower this is Cessna XXX in the pattern for touch and goes and they are telling me around. Slow day so getting a lot of practice so there was hardly any sweat. An emergency forced them to continue me on the downwind leg and wait for instructions, only no instructions came for about 10 minutes. I'm out of the pattern now and can see the old drag strip so know where I am. Called in and Tower was kind of mad, probably at themselves, turned me around and got me landed and told me that was enough touch and goes for the day. The instructor was eating lunch in the airport eatery and was a little worried too. A black dot right in front of me was not moving. At the time I was working on my commercial license in a 172 on about an 8-mile final. I was checking my instruments while on approach and when I looked up I saw a black dot that didn't show any relative movement and in a split second I realized that I'm going to hit it so I pushed the yoke forward as fast as I could. About 1 to 2 seconds later a bird came right above me. Was a flight attendant for a while and we used to get in the cockpit sometimes mid-flight when one of the pilots needed a wee, pretty standard procedure. So, one time sitting there and chatting with the FO, pitch dark outside, I noticed a yellow flashing light on the horizon. It was the only thing I could see outside and didn't really think much about it and kept talking with the pilot. After a couple of seconds, I looked again, and it had moved considerably. Couldn't tell the distance, but I would say it was far away from our aircraft, so I started to think something weird was going on. Immediately told the pilot and we couldn't figure out what it was, and we just stared when after maybe 5 seconds later it just flew from one side of the sky to the other and then into space. That thing gave me the most ominous feeling I ever had. I looked at the pilot, he looked back at me, and we just sat there in silence thinking WTF just happened. Immediately regretted not taking my phone out to record, but it has been a delightful story to tell on my following flights. My father was a commercial pilot for over 35 years and has been flying for over 45 years. He has all kinds of wild stories which range from searching for debris after the Challenger disaster to the mayhem he endured as a pilot during the 9/11 attacks and even towing banners at the Jersey Shore. But the craziest story I've asked him to retell a million times took place off the coast of NSW in Australia in the late 1970s. His plane and crew were in a traffic pattern and were delayed landing because there was quite literally an unidentified flying object on the radar that the tower was tracking. For a while they just circled around in this pattern waiting for other planes to land before they could enter the landing pattern, and lo and behold, the crew eventually got a direction of where this thing was, and when they looked out their windows they could see a cigar-shaped craft moving very slowly at about their same altitude. Upon seeing this, all of the crew and passengers who could see it audibly gasped, and my dad says that was the most disturbing part. Anyway, eventually it went out of scope, and they got all clear to land and nothing more came of it, but it was always my favorite story as a kid to hear from my pops. Not a pilot, but my dad is, private pilot. He's got a Cessna 172. One time we were flying into this tiny airport, owned and run by this one guy. We were flying in pattern, waiting to land because there was a plane taking off. The plane didn't make it. I remember my dad describing the air being thin. It took off, started to climb, and then suddenly dropped like a rock. They crashed. The pilot, a man, died on the scene. His wife at least made it to the hospital. We didn't find out what happened after that. They were an older couple, and the parents of the owner of the airport. They had been visiting him. He was the one working comms when it happened. I vividly remember the way the plane dropped, and the smoke/fire and the fire trucks/ambulance. The wait to land, watching the smoke rise and the awful broken up communication. Bush pilot here. Loaded an aircraft with a 200 kilograms dead wild boar once. Climbed to cruising altitude and the thing started squealing and unraveling from its straps. Its head was poking out of the bag, and looked right at me. Never been so scared in my life. No autopilot while flying in cloud and only had a screwdriver for self-defense. Air traffic control couldn't hear me beyond the squealing, so they wouldn't let me into their airspace, so I just found some random strip and landed there. The villagers still think I owe them a pig. I've been pretty lucky in my short piloting career, only around 60 hours as of right now, and am still in training. The scariest thing I've seen is a bald eagle about 8 feet from my left wingtip. It was only 8 feet from the wingtip because me and my instructor dove and rolled the plane as soon as possible. Those large birds are a serious hazard to small aircraft. I was in a Cessna 172s. Be careful of your animal pilots. Obligatory, not me but my dad. Also, not exactly scary, but super nasty. My dad used to work in the Air Force and was responsible for the mechanical engineering of the Lockheed C-130 Hercules airplanes. Part of his job was to complete the before flight checklist, a huge list of things that needed to be cleared in every plane or helicopter before flight. Another part of his job was occasionally training newbies in this position. On the first day of training, my dad always told the new guys to always check the engines for bird nests. If the plane had been grounded for a while, seagulls and pigeons would often nest in the engines. This wasn't necessarily a problem for the engines, but more of a huge annoyance because the cleanup could last for hours if the engines happened to be turned on while a bird was inside. Anyway, he was once giving a demonstration about the power control of each engine, and the newbies, who had completed their checklists for the first time that day, had forgotten to check the engine for birds. My dad noticed this and decided to teach them a lesson by stepping back while the pilot fired up the engine. The seagull inside got completely eviscerated, covering the new guys from head to toe in seagull guts and blood. They always remembered to check the engines after that. My brother is learning how to fly, and I've gone up with him once to touch and go. The thing I remember is them talking about where to crash land if we lose power. Something I didn't really prepare myself for, but I guess it's an airplane, so we got to do something. Was on an L-1011 flying back to Atlanta. We circled Atlanta forever it seemed, then the co-pilot walked down my aisle, opened a hatch in the floor beside me and started cranking out of a handle. He looked up at me and said, the landing gear wouldn't go down. I said, good to know. On my first solo cross-country, so my third time ever alone in an airplane, and cross-country flights refer just to a flight from one airport to another, not like all the way across the country. The conditions were pretty good when I took off, and at the surface they were good, but a little higher up the forecasted thunderstorms started developing a little earlier than forecasted. The whole way out there it was good, some cumulus clouds for sure, and plenty of thermals given how turbulent it was, but none of that is very notable for an August afternoon. By the time I had landed, taxied back, departed, and started on my way home they had definitely started to at least get pretty tall. I ended up flying under what was most likely a developing thunderstorm on my third solo. It was well clear in terms of cloud clearance, and it wasn't more developed than some big gray clouds, but there wasn't really a good way around it since there was quite a lot of development in the area and going around would have resulted in a fairly significant deviation from my flight plan, which obviously made me nervous on my first solo flight navigating. Everything worked out obviously, and I'm nearly to my private pilot's license now, but that was some added stress to an already stressful flight. Also came within probably 30 feet of one bald eagle, and 50 of another soaring together at 3,500 feet. On one hand it is pretty awesome to see such a cool creature way up there doing its thing, on the other a huge bird like that versus my little Piper Warrior wouldn't have ended well for anyone involved. Funny enough that was actually on one of my preparation flights for my solo XC, so I guess that was just an exciting route. I'm glad I don't have any really exciting stories yet though, given how little flying time I have I would be really unlucky if I did lol. Not a pilot, but I've personally witnessed an very odd moment. I was up at a rather nice kids camp one summer installing some access control, locks, card swipes, cameras, etc. It was situated on a rather large lake. There was also a fire nearby. One day I hear a bomber coming in for a refill. I should also note that this lake has zip lines going across it. Well-marked ones that a pilot should be able to see from the air. The pilot saw it when it was almost too late. I'd never seen a bird that large climb that fast. My grandfather was a pilot back in the 50s. When you could carry guns on board planes apparently. Anyway, he told me once how a passenger suffered a nervous breakdown. Depressurized the plane by shooting out a window because he saw something on the wing. This really isn't a flying story, nor is it really scary, but I'd imagine it was scary for the worker. The plane next to us was having its lavatory drained by the lava trucks. They open a porthole usually towards the back of the plane and start flushing out the contents. This is usually only done on successive flights, and not on every single one. The lava agent did not secure the pipe to the porthole correctly, and keep in mind the lava agent is only a couple of feet away from the porthole. When he turns on the vacuum, the pipe shoots out and the agent is doused in waste. He was sent immediately off. I have no idea where he would even go, as the airport didn't have any sort of shower, only eyewash stations. Needless to say, nobody really wanted to go near him, but they had to help him obviously. The new airport is much easier than the old one. Although landing in a smaller aircraft is still recipe for vomit bags. The old airport never failed to make people scream. Folks from Topeka on a missionary trip flying into Quito for the first time howling in terror like kids on their first roller coaster was the best part of flying into Quito. Altitude sickness in the terminal was the worst. I can understand why they moved it though. Bad idea to surround your airport with downtown and then surround your downtown with mountains. Yako, from an aviation standpoint. Well, there was the time the Navy tried to kill me. Which to be fair is about every time they're around me. I was flying backseat in the Arabian Gulf for a photo op. We were a few hundred feet off the water, flying formation off of AP-8. We were in close formation, behind two F-16s, two on each side. After the first pass, we banked it up over oil derricks, over an area we were specifically told not to fly over. There was a helicopter that we would fly under that took photos of us, which is really unnerving for a fighter. Now when you fly in close formation, you're a little gentler with your control inputs so you give your wingmen time to react and not get hit by you if you need to turn into them. The P-8 driver clearly had not flown close formation in a long time, because at the last second, in order to line up the photo pass better, suddenly banked and turned into us. Ultimately we were fine, but it's always unnerving to see a passenger jet turn into you when you're on one shoulder of a 4-lane highway and they're on the other one. The photos turned out really good, though. It is to my shame that I admit I nearly had a VFR into IMC. Inadvertent flight into IMC, instrument meteorological conditions, from VMC, visual meteorological conditions, is the accident cause of the highest fatality rate in general aviation, and is deadly for all pilots, even those who are instrument rated. So, I decided to fly in less than ideal weather as a new private pilot, but they could base is above circuit altitude, so I decided to fly, and have a look. It was just meant to be a sightseeing flight, and there was no mission, and I would return if things didn't look too good. Taxiing out, clouds get darker, and it visibly gets darker in the aircraft, a little C-150. I convince myself that I'm just imagining it and decide to take off. Lining up, small spots of rain start appearing on the windscreen. On takeoff roll, rain starts coming down pretty heavily. Climbing out, and visibility greatly reduced. Do an unbelievably bad circuit to land again, and everything was fine. But never had my hands shaken so much on the yoke. I'll also add that in general aviation, you should plan no time-critical mission that can't also be achieved with a car. VFR into IMC accidents are usually caused by pushing on into severe weather when you should turn around, go home, get your car and drive to your destination. Further to this, my instructor always told me takeoffs are optional, but landings are mandatory, and you can cancel a flight right up to takeoff speed, runway length and performance permitting of course, but generally runways are long enough allowing small GA aircraft to accelerate to rotation speed and stop again. When I was in flight school, taking my private pilot licensing test, the engine stalled. When I pulled the throttle out to simulate the stall, it cut. I'm thinking, well shit. Maybe my mix is too lean. Should start back up no prob. These old Cessnas can be cranky. So, I go through the restart checklist and... nothing. Looking for somewhere to land and all that's around cornfields, no, a lake, I'm not Captain Sully, and woods, also no. The one road I could land on safely was a state highway. FAA examiner agrees. Cue insanity. I'm out of the plane having a smoke and on the phone with police and then the airport. FAA is on the phone with I'm guessing the FAA or the police officers. Ick. Everyone is rubbernecking. Waving, honking, stopping. Cops get there. We make some small talk while the airport figures out how they're going to get their plane back. I told them we were fine, I just pulled over for a quick cigarette. We all had a good laugh, except for the examiner. Anyway, the plane gets back and goes right to the shop. I learned a few days later that an instructor had been up with a student earlier that day and told the head mechanic that the plane was acting a little funny. It had just come out of a rebuild though, so the mechanic wasn't worried. Just breaking back in. Needless to say, I switched airports after that. Oh, and the icing on the cake, the inspector failed me because I couldn't restart the plane. Flying a DA-40 in mountainous terrain in not so great weather. Got into a sinker trying to cross a ridge past the point of no return. Gave it full bore on the throttle and prop and still was sinking about 200 feet per minute down regardless of if I pitched for VX or VI. Cleared the ridge by about 200 foot, but being in a situation where you're giving it all you got and still descending into a mountain ridge is on my list of things I don't want to do again. My dad's story, not my own. He used to be an airline captain for a major UK operator. Back in the 90s his flight to Kabul was hijacked and the terrorists, demanding a ransom, would not let anyone off the plane once it landed. They stayed on the tarmac for 3 days straight, in 45°C heat, during which period no contact with ground services was allowed by the terrorists. A couple of passengers died from the heat exhaustion and dehydration, their bodies remaining in the cabin. Once the situation was brought under control, and my dad returned home, he suffered persistent nightmares which culminated in a series of heart attacks. He was medically discharged and never flew again. The sky was his life and love. When I had 1 whole hour of total flight time, I went to a fly-in event. The second morning, I woke up to the sound of this beautiful 1930s Howard taxiing out. I got out of my tent as it rolled down the runway and started climbing aggressively, then the engine died, and it came plummeting back down to the runway. It made this horrific sound and almost immediately burst into flames. Luckily, somehow, both occupants made it out uninjured. I was doing a nighttime cross-country with my flight instructor in the middle of nowhere Midwest. It was super dark. We made our landing, took off to head back home. All of a sudden, about 1 foot in front of the right wing, Cessna 150, we saw a flash of light. We were up high, so not a lightning bug. Not a cloud in the sky. We could figure it was a meteorite, though I can't be certain it got to the ground. Had we been going any faster at any part of that leg, I have to assume it would have gone through the wing, setting the fuel on fire. That was wild. Not a pilot, but one time I was flying with my dad, 4-seater plane, and we passed close enough to a vulture that we could see individual feathers, and it got buffeted around in our wake. It was basically perfectly lined up with the approach path, and if it had hit the wing, which would have been a very rough landing. If it had hit our prop, it would have been a very vertical landing. I had a great uncle, Ira. He flew in a B-24 in World War II as a bombardier. He never talked about the war. Especially to a kid who was only 11 or 12 in the mid-80s. But one year he came out to our town for the 4th of July. We were watching the fireworks in our front yard when he went missing. I went looking for him and found him the back of our living room, sitting on the floor. I was just a kid and didn't understand what PTSD was, although later in life I realized that I knew and worked with a lot of people who had it. I asked what was wrong, and he just looked at me with these haunted eyes and said, "I used to look down through my reticle at the towns and cities we flew over. I'd see these little pops of smoke, and I knew they were coming." He then went on to describe the dissension. How you could only barely see the dissension cannons firing if you were pretty low, and then you couldn't see the shells until they started blowing up all around you. He told me that he felt every little white pop of smoke he saw as if it was the one that was going to bring him down. Like it went right through him. I didn't see it, but every time I see dissension in movies now I think of my great uncle Ira and the look in his eyes. During a night cross-country with a friend of mine who was also a pilot in a 172, we were flying across an area by some mountains that's entirely lava rock. Like there's nothing there and nobody really goes there. Anyways, we were flying when suddenly there was a bright light off of our left wingtip. It was matching speed with us for like 5 seconds, then it zipped off towards the mountains and disappeared behind them. We both looked at each other and were like, WTF was that? Still have no idea what it was, but yes, that's the scariest thing I've seen as a pilot. An unmarked light jet blasting past me while flying over literal nowhere wilderness of Maine. I was scouting for decent hunting grounds for a friend and looking for a good clearing to put my bush plane down. Guy must have been doing at least 300 knots and buzzing just over the hills. Completely unmarked, no tail numbers, no insignias, no marked paint, just completely white, paneled over windows, hauling absolute ass and far lower than they should have been. Haven't seen anything like it since, and they were heading northwest, which would have put them even further into the wilderness. Only saw him for about 5 seconds before he dipped below the next hilltop. I had only just come out of a valley to hop over to the next one, and this man came blasting out of the valley I was going to. Haven't seen anything like it, but I don't go near that area anymore. Was piloting Capella Javelin, 60 kilometers, northeast from Dawson City. While flying relatively low and admiring the views of wilderness, saw a person below who was just standing and watching me from below. They had either no clothes or wore pastel-colored ones. This stunned me for a bit, and I decided to make a broad circle above him, or was it she? She didn't wave or try to attract my attention in any way. Just stood there, looking. As soon as it dawned on me, I felt really uncomfortable. It hit the fan when I saw 10 to 12 additional people slowly emerging from the closest trees. All of them too either didn't wear a thing or wore pastels. Turned around that instant and floored it. I had to get away from there as far as possible. Severe icing over the Canadian Rockies, just a few thousand feet above the tops. The problem was that much of the anti-ice equipment of the plane turned out to be broken, chiefly the heat on the sensor that measures airspeed. I'm flying the plane, the other pilot is in command, and was responsible for maintaining and checking the aircraft before flight. In a big cumulus cloud, I see ice appear, quickly, on the windscreen. I concentrate on flying the plane, out of the cloud. This is when the airspeed indication drops slowly. Initially, this looks like something atmospheric or worse, rapid accumulation of ice hurting performance. I push my nose forward to maintain speed because that's rather important in an airplane. We ended up losing quite some altitude before I diagnosed the problem with an old GPS device that was showing a high ground speed. The airspeed sensor iced up, which it does quickly when the heat doesn't work, and that caused the erroneous indication. At that point we followed some normal techniques to fly out of the clouds without the airspeed indication. We lost maybe 1,000 feet in 30 seconds. We got too close for comfort to the tops of the mountains that evening. The subsequent deviation around further weather then required careful consideration of available fuel. Not having our passports with us, for good reasons, and because of COVID, a fuel stop in Canada would have been illegal, something to avoid if safely possible. As an incredibly young flight instructor, I allowed the even less experienced pilot next to me to perform a 360 degrees autorotation, engine off glide. It got away from him, and I took the controls as the main rotor RPM dipped to 85%. Helicopters experience catastrophic, unrecoverable rotor blade failure at 80% plus 1% per 1,000 foot density altitude. We were about 4,000 foot density altitude that day. Closest near-death experience I ever had. I was flying a helicopter about 100 feet above the ground at the time. It was summer, so we had the back doors open for airflow. One of the things that airflow did was push my flight bag into my collective, power control, arm. This was annoying, so I rotated back and pushed my bag behind the seat. When I looked back out front I saw all the ground, no sky. Not normal. The rotation of my body had subconsciously, inadvertently pushed my cyclic arm forward, nose down. I quickly recovered, barely took the help above then and below 50 feet, but I was shaken. I felt like a real idiot. I learned that day how dangerous low level is and the seriousness of prioritizing your hands being on the controls. Not me flying, but my dad was a captain for decades. Final approach into Hong Kong, 237 souls on board in a Boeing 767. I was 16 and sitting jump seat. No FAA, there was a huge storm over the airport. Around 12 planes holding pattern, just circling around. We just came in from Mali, Maldives. We had about 2 hours of fuel remaining. Well, after an hour and 20 minutes, my father did the worst ass thing I've ever seen him do. Went from 7k feet to 1k in less than 60 seconds, bumpy as hell, lighting flashing, 0% visibility. Didn't see the runway until around 100 feet. Of course, he wasn't flying VFR. Seeing decades of experience come together made me respect my dad further into my life. Not a pilot, but when my stepdad was getting his pilot license years ago, he was doing all kinds of tricks in the small aircraft, flying it up and down like a zigzag. Before one of the drops my sister had taken her seatbelt off unbeknownst to everyone else on the plane because she dropped her Fury on the floor. The plane went down, she went up. Her head split and spurted blood everywhere and completely drenched me. We sat like that drenched in her blood for hours until we could have an emergency landing on a hospital roof in the middle of nowhere. We have a photo of us from that day, standing on the wing with our Furbish in our hands and happy, creepy to look back on. I don't have anything too crazy to share as I've only just started flying, but it was my third time flying on a 10-day course. I was in a Tomahawk, PA-38, which gets its nickname from its stalls. I didn't think too much about it. I do a basic stall and as we start experiencing buffet shaking, you are supposed to just use the rudders to stay balanced. I get nervous and use the aileron, immediately dropping a wing, falling out of the sky very quickly. My instructor takes control and does some crazy maneuvers to gain back altitude, but it was so scary. But afterwards I heard that the day before someone had done the same thing and lost 1,000 feet of altitude. Once a quad bike entered the RWI when I was landing. At the time I was still learning, so my flight instructor took the controls and landed in the grass next to the RWI, proceeding to yell at the kid. Once I was flying with my friend's grandfather and we were doing circles around 3,000 feet above the airport. Anyway, I hear someone saying he's passing the above the airfield at 3,000 feet. I look to the left and like 50 meters away there's an airplane. I used to fly gliders. One of the instructors was very keen on not having the students ride the controls during tuition. You only had to breathe on the joystick, and he would let you know directly that he was PF. Once I'd soloed, he was a bit friendlier than before, and related a horror story of an ab initio student he'd flown with about 10 years earlier. The chippy in question was, allegedly, a former hang glider pilot and skydiver who was looking to expand his horizons. He was greatly confident and outgoing. His day job was as a managing director, and was obviously very keen to get in the air. Fair enough, having strapped him into the front seat, our instructor got in the back, the winch cable was attached and off they went. The student locked on the controls. He had both feet hard on the rudder pedals and was holding the stick centrally with an absolute grip of iron. He was in total panic, and by this stage the glider was passing through 200 feet and starting to drift to one side. The instructor had to shout at the students several times to let go of everything. By the time he complied, and the cable release pulled, they were a long way off to the side and a lot lower than a normal launch. This was a ridge site, so they could have still moved forward into the lift, but he was so shaken up he elected to fly a shortened circuit and land. Throughout the approach he was terrified this clown was going to go for the controls again, but fortunately they landed without further incident. I suspect the post-flight debriefing was short and interesting, and probably ended with him departing rather more quietly than when he arrived. A few years later, our instructor heard he had bought a Cessna based at a field about 20 miles away. Perhaps he had learned his lesson, or perhaps he was destined to be a statistic. Seeing the smiling faces of two people in a Cessna as they nearly missed flew by me during training in our local practice area. They weren't talking to anyone, and it was surprising to see an airplane just appear then go past so quickly, but the scary part was seeing their eyes and teeth. They were that close to my plane. It was uncontrolled airspace, and I guess ultimately we were both responsible for separation, but it happens very quickly, and even with a lookout it's not easy to spot a glint of metal in a vast open sky. Not a pilot, but my friend was flying from CO to Vietnam for work, and right before they were about to go over the ocean the pilot said they were diverting to LA due to a small crack in the front windshield. Pretty quickly after that they dropped super low in altitude, and everyone seemed to get really tense. When they landed and everyone was exiting the plane, they could see the entire front windshield of the plane was cracked. Good thing they weren't in the middle of the ocean when that crack first happened. I used to be a gliding instructor in these little trusses framed in fabric gliders. We were doing a training flight and a bolt of lightning struck the ground about a mile from us. Unlike a lot of other aircraft, we don't have systems in place to mitigate lightning strikes. Basically, it would have exploded a good chunk if it had hit us. Never descended and landed on the ground so quickly. Our plane attempted to land on the runway near the beach, but failing to do so 3x, with strong wind and rain. Those 3 attempts at landing were worse than roller coaster levels, since it was either we were almost down but would instantly pull up, or the wheels would hit, and the plane would sway then speed up again since there isn't enough runway to stop. Vomit was flying all over the plane. Eventually announced that we had diverted to another airport with a longer runway. Since there wasn't enough fuel to go back to the city, worse, this airport we landed at is closed since there weren't any other scheduled flights, so we couldn't leave or eat. Had to wait for another plane hours later. The airline company was aptly named Asian Spirit. Since there's a good chance you'll land as a spirit no longer on the physical plane, thankfully this airline no longer exists. Growing up we lived out in the country. My neighbor across the road had some acres and had mowed a runway out in one of his fields for his small airplane. We used to see him flying overhead quite often and would watch him land out just to the east of his house in a hayfield. Then we noticed we didn't really see his airplane anymore. Come to find out, on what ended up being his last flight things went as usual and he landed in his field, but his chocolate lab ran out to greet him and went right through the propeller. Pretty traumatic for him, and the plane went into storage shortly after, and I don't think he has flown since. I can just fly small planes, but while getting the license, I took one of the solo flights. Just a short triangle with 2 stops. At one stop I was refueling. When I got back to home base, I realized that I forgot to put the fuel cap back on. That was actually scary. Not having the cap is not a big deal if you're on the ground. But while in the air, the lower pressure directly above the hull can suck out fuel. I was lucky that the flight was only half an hour or so and I had a fuel tank. Afterwards I drove to the other field and got the cap back, smiley face. I fly general aviation and one time I was with my father in my V-tailed small plane and we were on our final approach and there was 2 thunderstorms closing in on the airport and as we went to land the tailwind was so extreme I almost sent the plane into a barrel roll almost 10 feet above the ground and we are both fine but I was so close to not being able to recover it scared me straight. I was training for my PPL out of Gillespie Field, KSA in El Cajon, California with my CFI in a Piper Archer 3, coming back from a check ride prep flight, on short final for 27R when all of a sudden right in front of us a 172 comes diving down, and eventually makes its way to 27L. It was about 600 feet above and in front and it startled my CFI and myself. The strangest thing is that tower did not reprimand the pilot. We were number 1 for 27R. Another glider plane coming straight at me on a hang. Glider planes are really hard to see up in the air, especially when you look at them straight on. I think we were 50 m apart when we spotted each other, both pilots making a sharp turn off the mountain hang and into the valley below. I've also had power cables in my flight path, while losing altitude in my paraglider. I considered turning back and landing in the dense forest, but in the end went over them. Never flew from that place again. Another airplane that almost collided with me head-on. I was doing touch and goes at an uncontrolled airfield. Made proper radio calls. As I was departing to fly back to my home airport, my instructor grabbed the yoke and banks right, really hard. That's when I see the guy in front of us do the same. Nothing too bad. While flying a Cessna as a student pilot we saw some white flares go up in an area ahead of us. My instructor was visibly worried, but calm, and guided us back to our aerodrome. He radioed our position in the tower but didn't get any information back about other planes etc. From what I can remember I think it was collision avoidance, but why did they never say it on the radio? I have an idea. Anyone know why white flares might be for? There was a military base with fake silos ahead. There was no fly zone or anything. I was working as a HEMS crew as a paramedic, not pilot, self-loading cargo. Launched to go IFR 10,000 foot north for a 60-minute trip over the Northwoods. As we get up to about 2,000 feet we hear a sound that resembled a table saw. Talk about it's the pilot who hears it too. We decided to return to the hospital. We landed and the noise stopped. The pilot starts adding power to lift again and as we get about level W the roof of the hospital the noise returns. We abort and land. Out of service. Mechanic comes in. We pulled a foreign object into one of our engines and evidently was within 60 seconds of the engine spinning itself apart which likely would have taken out the other one. Thankfully we were able to land, no issues. Had we pressed on we'd have been trying to auto-rotate into the Northwoods at night. Pretty much the most terrifying was visual conditions that deteriorated rapidly into IMC, poor pre-flight planning on my part and an overestimation of my understanding of how far smoke from a forest fire really goes. Made it through okay but it was a notable example of that 180 seconds to live video. I was really glad I had started my instrument training not long before it had occurred, so I was able to keep the plane upright and was using the GPS to get to the closest airport. Really fortunate there was nothing around to hit at altitude either. Ace Combat 7 pilot here. I was once flying the X-02S Strike Wyvern in Mission 7, hard mode, with the electromagnetic launcher. Big mistake. I lost most of my co-pilots due to the countless drones, but I say screw it, I'm a veteran ace pilot and have completed all 6 games on hard mode. I can do this. I'll do it alone. So, I equipped my long-range missiles, which worked pretty well for potshots. As I get close to the ace, I realize I'm too low on missiles to take him out, so I'm forced to use the slow-to-fire electromagnetic launcher. I managed to get a few well-placed shots that severely damaged him. I likely needed one more shot to make the kill and had him directly in my sights, as I was about to pull the trigger, the ace performs an expertly timed post-stall maneuver, flips right over me, and shoots me while inverted. I've never seen anything like that before, and I nearly jumped out of my couch. A terrible yet fantastic mission. It was beautiful. That the rubber bands the ground crew are busy knotting up under the floorboards of the cockpit are way over the 5,000 hour mark, you can tell by the little strips and strands that stick out of the coiled, knotting rubber bands all over the place, and it smells like old burning or smoldering hot rubber every time you lift the observation and access door to check listed off on the pre-flight, and the head stew is in a foul-ass mood even before she boards, and starts screaming at the closely packed, carry-on swinging, baby stowing, sardine-packed and drunk passengers, and the ground crew just before taxi ing and takeoff. When the co-pilot is so drunk he keeps trying to make a pass at the navigator, while he believes it's the head stew, especially when SHE's red flagged and flying with all guns blazing, you know it's going to be that kind of flight. That, and your baggage just went to Scranton on the red-eye lifting off of our 34 north, heading 68.95 directional, on the port side. And, you are 25 minutes late, as the heavy fog rolls in, and the nav flickers just a touch. Not a pilot, but one time I was flying back from Turkey to England. The airport is one of the highest in the UK and the only one, I'm fairly sure, built over a major road. Well, on the descent we hit an air pocket, barely made it over the fence at the beginning of the runway. I was quite young, probably 11 or so, but I remember a lot of screaming, crying, and praying. Also, really harsh braking, happy to say I haven't hit one since, but it's always in my mind when I fly. Not a pilot. This happened on my parents' honeymoon in Hawaii. They went to so many unusual places I think they also went to the Bahamas as well. Anyways, they were flying over what is known as the Bermuda Triangle. The plane had terrible turbulence and the wind pushed it so hard it nearly flipped over. My dad later told me that if you were standing you could have walked on the walls of the plane because it was tilted so much. But due to its shaking you would have been thrown around. A plane that narrowly missed colliding with me. I was on a flight home in contact with ATC on a cloudy day. Another aircraft, unknown to me and against ATC, started climbing up. Now I was flying a low wing, and they were in a high wing, carrying skydivers, and below me, so visibility was an issue in addition to the clouds. Out of the corner of my eyes, I suddenly see this plane passing right below me by about 10 feet, about a wing's length of my small aircraft. ATC only noticed this happened after the fact and was on the other pilot for violating their altitude instructions. I do still, to this day, wonder why there was not some sort of danger alert to ATC as they were getting closer. We were in contact and on radar with the same controller. I had a plane from another training school conduct a power-off rapid descent right in front of me while we were in uncontrolled airspace. He wasn't talking on my frequency so didn't even know I was there. He passed by so close that we could read his registration and the name of the school. Needless to say, my instructor was quite angry and made a few irate phone calls to that school once we got back. The position light on the tail of the aircraft in front of me rapidly approaching and the guy on the controls doing nothing to resolve the issue. Got within 1.5 rotor discs before I took the controls and turned us away to avoid the inevitable collision. There was another time where we hit a bird in a snow shower at night while under goggles. Here we are flying along at 90 kts with the snow flying by making it look like we're doing lightspeed in a Star Wars film when all of a sudden, the windscreen shatters and some hammers my co-pilot in the face and starts flapping around in the tiny cockpit of an OH-58. I'm still surprised I survived that one. I started working at a small hangar/fuel trucks at a small rural airport. I passed all the training to do the important/stressful radio/drive/fuel tasks on the tarmac, but nobody told me what a helicopter looks like on autorotation or that there was a training school at the end of the runway. I was driving down the runway in my fuel truck and saw a small R-44 just falling from the sky. I sped up, hoping to help, and called the tower in a panic yelling about an inevitable crash and to send emergency trucks, only to watch the helicopter make a controlled landing/touch and go up again. The tower personnel could be heard laughing over the radio as they calmed me down/made fun of me. Helicopter pilot radio me too, to warn me about another practice autorotation. Co-workers found out and whenever we worked together I'd get watch out if a helicopter flew by. I'm a pilot in training, as I sometimes call it. On this day I was going out for my very first flight orientation. When we were flying, the plane went over some really drastic cliffs. The turbulence was so bad that it felt as if you were being thrust up about 100 feet 1 second and thrown down the next. It made me really nervous. Took off in my Piper Arrow and somehow the fuel line from the engine to the fuel pressure gauge ruptured, resulting in raw fuel streaming into the cockpit. As I was becoming soaked in aviation fuel, I declared an emergency and was cleared back to the airport for a landing any way possible, as all other traffic was held by ATC. Needless to say, I was scared $and I flew for FedEx and my plane had engine failure. We dove into the ocean close to an island thankfully, and I had to learn to fish and survive on my own for years. Everyone thought I'd died, and mentally I had. I made friends with a ball that I named Wilson, but unfortunately he got swept away as I encountered rough waters on my journey for survival. Luckily, I made it back, and sadly only to find my wife had moved on with Chris Noth from Love and the City. Damn, guy seriously gets all the girls. Home wrecker. So, I was pretty tired, and it was late. Last flight, and I am driving back home. I was a flight attendant there, BTW. Suddenly some tribulations. Wow. I look through a window and the sky are clear. Then a little girl, let's call her Susan, shouts, "Monster on the wing." A woman, supposedly her mother, assured her monsters don't exist. We looked through the window and there was some strange shadow. It was dark. Later everything was all right. We landed. But a few days later I noticed strange scars on that wing. In my part of the world, or should say sky, there are legends about sky goblins. Cue X-Files music. Not a real pilot, but I have 750 hours in Microsoft Flight Simulator in hard mode. But there were a lot of things we couldn't do in State Route 71, but we were the fastest guys on the block and loved reminding our fellow aviators of this fact. People often asked us if, because of this fact, it was fun to fly the jet. Fun would not be the first word I would use to describe flying this plane. Intense, maybe. Even cerebral. But there was one day in our sled experience when we would have to say that it was pure fun to be the fastest guys out there, at least for a moment. It occurred when Walt and I were flying our final training sortie. We needed 100 hours in the jet to complete our training and attain mission-ready status. Somewhere over Colorado we had passed the century mark. We had made the turn in Arizona and the jet was performing flawlessly. My gauges were wired in the front seat, and we were starting to feel fairly good about ourselves, not only because we would soon be flying real missions, but because we had gained a great deal of confidence in the plane in the past 10 months. Ripping across the barren deserts 80,000 feet below us, I could already see the coast of California from the Arizona border. I was, finally, after many humbling months of simulators and study, ahead of the jet. I was beginning to feel a bit sorry for Walter in the back seat. There he was, with no really pleasant view of the incredible sights before us, tasked with monitoring 4 different radios. This was good practice for him for when we began flying real missions, when a priority transmission from headquarters could be vital. It had been difficult, too, for me to relinquish control of the radios, as during my entire flying career I had controlled my own transmissions. But it was part of the division of duties in this plane and I had adjusted to it. I still insisted on talking on the radio while we were on the ground, however. Walt was so good at many things, but he couldn't match my expertise at sounding smooth on the radios, a skill that had been honed sharply with years in fighter squadrons where the slightest radio miscue was grounds for beheading. He understood that and allowed me that luxury. Just to get a sense of what Walt had to contend with, I pulled the radio toggle switches and monitored the frequencies along with him. The predominant radio chatter was from Los Angeles Center, far below us, controlling daily traffic in their sector. While they had us on their scope, albeit briefly, we were in uncontrolled airspace and normally would not talk to them unless we needed to descend into their airspace. We listened to the shaky voice of a lone Cessna pilot asking Center for a readout of his ground speed. Center replied, "November Charlie 175, I'm showing you at 90 knots on the ground." Now the thing to understand about Center controllers was that whether they were talking to a newcomer pilot in a Cessna, or to Air Force One, they always spoke in the exact same, calm, deep, professional, tone that made one feel important. I referred to it as the Houston Center voice. I have always felt that after years of seeing documentaries on this country's space program and listening to the calm and distinct voice of the Houston controllers, that all other controllers since then wanted to sound like that, and that they basically did. And it didn't matter what sector of the country we would be flying in, it always seemed like the same guy was talking. Over the years that tone of voice had become somewhat of a comforting sound to pilots everywhere. Conversely, over the years, pilots always wanted to ensure that, when transmitting, they sounded like Chuck Yeager, or at least like John Wayne. Better to die than sound bad on the radios. Just moments after the Cessna's inquiry, a Twin Beach piped up on frequency, in a rather superior tone, asking for his ground speed. I have you at 125 knots of ground speed. Boy, I thought, Beechcraft really must think he is dazzling his Cessna brethren. Then unexpectedly, a Navy F-18 pilot out of NAS Lemoore came up frequently. You knew right away it was a Navy jock because he sounded very cool on the radios. Center, Dusty 52 ground speed check. Before Center could reply, I'm thinking to myself, hey, Dusty 52 has a ground speed indicator in that $1 million cockpit, so why is he asking Center for a readout? Then I got it, old Dusty here is making sure that every bug smasher from Mount Whitney to the Mojave knows what true speed is. He's the fastest man in the valley today, and he just wants everyone to know how much fun he is having in his new Hornet. And the reply, always with that same, calm, voice, with more distinct alliteration than emotion, Dusty 52, Center, we have you at 620 on the ground. And I thought to myself, is this a ripe situation, or what? As my hand instinctively reached for the mic button, I had to remind myself that Walt was in control of the radios. Still, I thought, it must be done, in mere seconds we'll be out of the sector and the opportunity will be lost. That Hornet must die and die now. I thought about all of our sim training and how important it was that we developed well as a crew and knew that to jump in on the radios now would destroy the integrity of all that we had worked toward becoming. I was torn. Somewhere, 13 miles above Arizona, there was a pilot screaming inside his space helmet. Then, I heard it. The click of the mic button from the back seat. That was the very moment that I knew Walter and I had become crew members. Very professionally, and with no emotion, Walter spoke, Los Angeles Center, Aspen 20, can you give us a ground speed check? There was no hesitation, and the reply came as if was an everyday request. Aspen 20, I show you at 1,842 knots, across the ground. I think it was the 42 knots that I liked the best, so accurate and proud was Center to deliver that information without hesitation, and you just knew he was smiling. But the precise point at which I knew that Walt and I were going to be really good friends for a long time was when he keyed the mic once again to say, in his most fighter pilot-like voice, Center, much thanks, we're showing closer to 1900 on the money. For a moment Walter was a god. And we finally heard a little crack in the armor of the Houston Center voice, when Lan come back with, Roger that Aspen, your equipment is probably more accurate than ours. You boys have a good one. It all had lasted for just moments, but in that short, memorable sprint across the Southwest, the Navy had been flamed, all mortal airplanes on free were forced to bow before the king of speed, and more importantly, Walter and I had crossed the threshold of being a crew. A fine day's work. We never heard another transmission on that frequency all the way to the coast. For just one day, it truly was fun being the fastest guys out there. My dad is a pilot and he said that his scariest story was when he was flying to Ohio, I think. And after like 2 hours of flying there was a stewardess who said to land cause there was a destroyed helicopter that was on fire going near his direction, so he landed and the helicopter was destroyed and on fire for like 3 to 4 hours. The firefighters got the fire out. Turns out the helicopter was having bombs and more stuff on it that the people who was steering and wanted to kill somebody who was on the plane. I was launching my drone in the field. It was a homemade drone weighing almost 2 kilograms. I've been doing it for over 6 months. I raised it to a height of about 50 meters, suddenly it started shaking. I realized that it was time to go to the landing, but I didn't have time. One of the propellers crumbled and broke during the descent. After that, he abruptly flew down. I saw it in slow motion, as if time had stopped. Then I found my broken drone. I must say, my soul was broken at that moment. The scariest part for the doomed passengers was probably the fact that flames filled the rear of the cabin and the floor actually melted underneath them. While some were not going to survive, at least of them half could have had the captain bring the aircraft to a stop as soon as he landed and had ordered an emergency evacuation. When flying low-level survey work in exceptionally low visibility, 1-2 SM, at 150 foot above ground, there were towers in our area that we could not see, so decided to deviate around them to be safe. Visibility dropped and we were fully within clouds with 4 towers taller than us to the north, east and south. Heading indicator and attitude indicator known to be less than reliable in that plane. Flew fully IFR for 5 minutes at 150 foot above ground with obstacles. Clouds were 3,000 foot thick, so climbing through them wasn't an option. You have to be willing to die for the company.
Back in 2000, hubby flew a Cessna 172. We took the day off, kids in school, beautiful September day. We planned to fly through the Twin Towers, around the Statue of Liberty, and down to Atlantic City for lunch and some gambling. When we got near the Twin Towers, there were 2 helicopters and 3 other small planes in the pattern, and I wasn't thrilled to be in the mix of this. We switched to circling the Statue of Liberty and headed to AC, had lunch, won a little bit, and started to head home. ACY Airport lets us know 2 AF jets broke the restricted zone and we needed to go 2 clicks east and stay at 2,500 feet. The husband says, I didn't think they could break the restricted zone, and I replied with they did it in Top Gun. So AYC tells us we are fine and watch for jet wash, they will be passing under us. FFS, even tightly strapped in, our heads hit the roof as the first one went under, the second was 5 seconds behind, heads hit again. My husband did amazing, but I had to dig my nails out of my palms and had bruises to show the next day at work. Once we landed, one of the guys from the air club asked how our day was and husband answered with it was an ass sweat kind of flight. My fiancé was flying in a military plane, working, when he looked out the window and noticed one of the turbines on the wing smoking. He radios up, trying to stay calm, and goes, guys, I think our wing is on fire. And the pilot goes, again? Hold on, let me kill the engines. My fiancé says he has never been more terrified than in that moment, especially cause if the plane goes down, his life is not the priority. The destruction of his equipment was, even if it cost him his life. They killed the engines, coasted for a minute or 2, then turned them back on, and everything was good. What's really bad is the other plane was under maintenance for an even worse issue, so that was the only plane that could get into the air, and it had to fly constantly for their mission, so they had to keep using it until the other plane got fixed. My fiancé wasn't part of the regular flight crew, normal guy was sick and fiancé had the training and clearance, so they pulled him for it, and he said he never complained again about loading or unloading the planes after that.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.